Buenos dias and good morning, 92.9 KGPJ. This broadcast of the Union Gospel Press Sunday School lesson is sponsored by the Redeemer Missionary Baptist Church-Lancaster, where Dr. Kevin A. Norville Sr. serves as pastor. We encourage you to follow us on Facebook and worship with us at 9:30 a.m. on Sunday. Por favor, síguenos en Facebook y adora con nosotros los domingos a las 9:30 en la mañana. For more information regarding Monday Night Bible Class, Wednesday Bible Study, or becoming a broadcast sponsor, please visit us at www.rmbclancaster.org. We would love to hear from you. Clases de Bíblica o más información, visitamos en www.rmbclancaster.org. As Dr. Norville breaks bread, feel free to call 214-235-0683 to offer comments and ask questions regarding today's lesson. Be blessed. Si tiene preguntas o comentarios sobre la lección de hoy, llame a 2142-350683. Sea bendecido.
They laugh, they scorn, reject, and mock, but my purpose is greater. So brother, I don't stop. Time has been given. Time keeps ticking.
Good morning, good morning. I'm Deacon Charles Watkins with the Redeemer Missionary Baptist Church. Back again this Saturday we're going to go over the Union Gospel Press Sunday School lesson for this week. Before we do that, I'd like to be able to thank Dr. Kevin Norville for allowing me to take part in this, as well as all the members of the Redeemer Missionary Baptist Church who are also working behind the scenes to make this broadcast possible. I also would like to thank our fine host at KGPJ Radio, Pastor Warren and Sister Shelley, for hosting us and helping us getting out the Word of God. So today, what we're going to continue to be in the book of Judges. Here we're going to today we're going to be talking about Gideon here, and I will read our title of our lesson today is God Confirms Gideon's Mission. The lesson text comes from Judges chapter 7 verse 2 through 4, and also 13 through 15, and chapter 8 verses 22 to 25. Our golden text today reads, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and interpretation thereof, he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord had delivered into your hand the host of Midian. Starting with our introduction here, I would like to read from the Union Gospel Press here, and our introduction reads as the biblical account of Gideon begins in a similar way to other cycles in Judges. A vast horde of Midianite enemies along with some allies would appear regularly just at the time of harvest to plunder and destroy the crops. Israel was repeatedly left in an impoverished condition as a result. In time, the Israelites cried out to God for deliverance, and God responded by calling Gideon to deliver them. What we remember most about Gideon's call is his reluctance to accept what God was telling him. After all, he was an unknown from an insignificant clan within the tribe of Manasseh, and had apparently never been in a leadership position. However, God often chose unexpected people for important leadership roles and then equips them to accomplish his work that was his plan for Gideon. So our lesson outline breaks out into three. There are three outlines here. The first outline is called readiness, and it comes from Judges chapter 7, verse 2 through 4. The second outline is confirmation, Judges chapter 7, verse 13 through 15. And the conclusion is Judges chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. Today's aim is the fact to show that God helped Gideon and his people understand that the Lord was still in charge in dealing with the Midianites. The principle here is to grasp the truth that God is in control of every situation we face. Let me repeat that, because we tend to say that without recognizing or putting emphasis on that principle. God is in control of every situation that we face. Not just the ones that we call him on, but every situation that we face. God is in control of that. The application is to teach that because God is in total control of our situation, we must learn to let God rule. So we're going to start out here in reading our the first portion here of readiness, Judges chapter 7, verse 2 through 4. And it reads as this: And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, My own hand hath saved me. Verse 3, Now therefore go to proclaim into the ears of the people, saying, Whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000. There remained 10,000. And the Lord said unto Gideon, These people are yet too many. Bring them down unto the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be that whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee, or whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So I'm going to read here a little bit from my little commentary here in these verses, and then we're going to go back and try and discuss some to get a little better, clear understanding of them. So here in Judges chapter 7, verse 2 through 4, and as Christians, we often underestimate the power of our Almighty God. As a result, we do not trust him enough, especially when we face seemingly overwhelming obstacles. We think we know better than he does. Gideon learned in a unique way that he had to trust God to direct his steps. In fact, God told Gideon, whose other name was Zerubbabel, that he wanted him to reduce his army, weeding out those who were afraid to go into battle. After that, God told Gideon to take his men down to the water, where the Lord would disclose how many he would weed out, even more men, before they went to war with the Midianites. Through all of this, God was making it very clear that when the battle was over, the Israelites would know that it was by his strength that they won, and not by their own human strength or wisdom. 22,000 fearful men went home at first, leaving only 10,000 to go into the war. Then at the water, Gideon's army was reduced to a mere 3,000. There's a lesson here for us. God can bring victory in any situation with many or few people. The number does not matter to him, but he does graciously choose to work with us to accomplish his goals. So, what we see here in this first part of readiness, getting ready, we see what God tells Gideon. The people you have are too many. So here we see Gideon with 32,000 men prepared to go to war. Now, the Midianites, they are on, at that time, they were raiding the place. When harvest season came, they came in to raid all the grain, the barley, and whatever that the Israelites had harvested and gathered. The Midianites would come in on camelback and they had an army who were on camelback, who's on the backs of camels, and they could move as quick as they want to, and there were large numbers of these people. What we see here is that Israel had, once again, how they became under the bondage of the Midianites. They had slipped back into sin, and now the Midianites are somewhat lording over them. Once again, the Israelites and judges cry out to God. But at the same time here, what we see when it comes to Gideon was not a man of stature. He was not a man who even was a leader at the time. I believe Gideon was he was working on the threshing floor. Okay, being able to separate the chaff from the wheat. In other words, that's what he was doing, collecting the wheat and separating it. But even before we read into this, when the Midianites were still roaming the land, Gideon was in hiding, as a lot of the Israelites, because they were afraid of the Midianites. But what we see here is God is about to raise up a man. Gideon is about to raise him up. A man who doesn't have any, his name is not known. He is not known as a leader of Israel or what have you. But we see God here once again taking the weakness of man and using it. And we, in our lesson here, we're going to try and learn that all that we think we know, we may not be prepared. We are not ready for what God wants us to do. Because the thing is, God is the one who gets the glory. God is the one who wants to be seen as, it is I who is doing this here for the people, not we ourselves. So here God raises up a man, Gideon here. And he goes and he tells them, these people, in verse 2, that are with you are too many. Now bear in mind, the Midianites is a large number of men on camelback. Gideon is raised up his 32,000. Okay? To go up against it. Then, but God sees this here. You got 32,000. If you go up against the Midianites and if you win, you would say that it was your own hand. It was you who delivered you. You wouldn't give God the glory and whatsoever. So what he does is he says you need to pare down your army. And in the way that, in a sense, that he is doing it, in a sense, he goes and he says in verse, going into verse 3, now therefore go proclaim to the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful. Here's the thing. God tells Gideon now, go to your army and ask whoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. Just with this one, who among us is fearful and afraid? This has nothing to do with pride. This is being honest here. Okay? Because in this here, in other words, Gideon has raised up an army. I don't know how he come about gathering these men. But then again, there's 22,000 of them that are fearful and afraid, as we see. So 22,000 leave him of the people. This is basically getting ready, paring down the troops, in other words. And the Lord said unto Gideon in verse 4, you still have too many. Now you're dealing with 10,000 and the Lord God says you got too many still. So then the Lord, he says, well, I will begin to show you, bring them to this brook, down into the water, where I will try them there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee. The same shall go with thee of whomsoever I say unto thee. this shall not go with thee. The same shall not go. So 10,000. So what God does is he brings them down. If we read for ourselves a little bit into it, they go down to the water. And the Lord watches how they drink water. And it is so... my thing, this is... I saw that as being watchful. If a man got down on his knees and also on his elbows and he began to drink water, he's not able to react quickly. He's not watching what is around him. He is not seeing, still in that mood of looking for his enemy. He's somewhat almost in a relaxed mode, in a sense. So, but what God wants to do, he wants to find a man who will lick water like a dog. Now, I don't know about you. I know we watch dogs many times as they lick water. One thing we do know is this: if you're around, their eyes is up and they're still licking that water. And they're being watchful. It's not a comparison to that, but here, I didn't say it. It's right. It's not in our lesson, but if we read, some of the scriptures before that, it is there. Looking for men who was able to lap water like dogs. And out of that, there was 300 men. Watchful men. So, we say when the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, he blew a trumpet, and Abijah was gathered after him. Then he sent messengers through all of Manasseh, who also was gathered after him. He sent messages unto Asher and to Zebulun, unto Naphtali, and they came up and meet with them. And it was after the gathering of the military men that Gideon did his 2 fleece tests with God. Now, you also read in there where this fleece test that Gideon has here, as far as the dew being on the fleece, and the other test is that the dew is on the fleece, but the ground is dry, and vice versa. The dew is on the ground, but the fleece is dry. You can read into that and get an understanding of this was Gideon's proof. Gideon wanted proof from God, in a sense. So God reassured them that he indeed was going to use Gideon for his work. This time, however, God was not going to accomplish his task of any normal way. He intended to deliver Israel in such a way that it would be obvious that it was his doing, not their own. For that reason, he worked with Gideon to reduce the size of his army. God said, the people that are with you, they are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, my own hands have saved me. If Gideon's faith was in the size of his army, that faith was about to be tested. A simple challenge was thrown out to the gathered men. If any of them were afraid, they could leave and go back home. The simple test. Partly because of the length of time they had been dominated, and because of the strength of the enemy, there was too much fear among them. Can you imagine the look in Gideon's face as he watched 22,000 men leave? This could have shaken Gideon here. 22,000 men leaving only 10,000. While it might have been shocking to him, perhaps he reasoned that 10,000 could still win. Sometimes when you go to battle, you want to have as many men as you can, as many as possible. But here we see God is basically preparing Gideon for this fight. So he had 10,000 men, since they were being commissioned by God. Our faith is being tested for at least 2 reasons: to show whether our faith is real or counterfeit, and second, to strengthen our faith for the task he sets before us. So what we see now is Gideon has 10,000. He was shocked that he was going to have to proceed with just 10,000 men. Imagine his thoughts after God's next instruction was. The God turns and tells him, you still have too many men. There still are too many. We discovered later that the Midianite force numbered 135,000 Midianites. That's according to chapter 8, verse 10. So it was a formidable foe that Gideon faced. To have God reduce his little army from 32,000 to 10,000. That was quite a test, but now God said he needed to reduce even more. There will be no glory for Israel from this battle. God's instructions was for Gideon was to take the men to the water and have them drink. He would then tell Gideon which ones should stay with him and which ones should leave for home. He didn't explain what the criteria was going to be in his decision, so Gideon had to obey with simple faith. We cannot help wonder what his thoughts were. God had already reduced his army to a pitiful number. Now he will reduce it even more. Perhaps Gideon was confident because of the assurance that he had received earlier. The test unknown to men. So the men knew nothing of this test here. It was just an observation of how they drink. It appeared that those who knelt down and put their face right down to the water were separated from those who reached for the water with their hands, drawing it up to their mouth to drink. Only this latter group was kept, perhaps for the logical reason that in drinking this they remained more alert to their surroundings than did others. Gideon was left with 300 men to face an enemy of 135,000. Clearly, it would be God's battle, not Israel's. So even in this preparation here, and God in preparing for war, he has a plan, because God knows us, and that he knows is that if he gives us, if we're given, if he tells us to do something and then we go up and overboard, see, we begin to want to be too smart. We want to begin to use our own wits. We'll talk and ask the Lord for what to give us, but then we want to add our own 2 cents in. So then we begin to want to get to a point whereas we'll be able to, in other words, if we went into battle with 32,000 men and we win this battle, it'll be all on us, all on our hands. We will have the big head, even in our own little battles of today. Whatever is put before us, will allow God's strength to work within us. Sometimes we are not used by God because of the simple reasons because we're too smart. We're too, in other words, we're not humble. We're not weak enough. We want to show our strength. We want it to be about us. We want to shine. But throughout the Bible, what we see is that the weakness of men whom God has used. The book of Judges, the weakness of men. Look at Moses, the weakness of men. Paul, Peter, the weakness of men. What God has used. If we can get that within us, there's a reason why. Why is it that he's picking these weak? God is picking the weak. So he can get the glory. So he wants you to know that it is not about you. It is not you doing this. It is him. That's what he wants. Rely on me. I am the one. Allow me to fight your battles, as the Lord say. That's what he would like for us to do. Come, be humble. I know we think we know a lot. But then again, if we really and truly would like to be used of God, I'm not going to say we're going to learn how to be weak. It's just that sometimes he doesn't use us because guess what? We know too much. Simple as that. Or we think we know too much. So we're going to move on here to the confirmation section of our outline. And that is chapter 7, starting verse 13 through 15. And we're going to go here and we're going to kind of read here. And then we're going to kind of discuss it as well. Starting at verse 13. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow, and said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent, and smote it, that it fell, and overturned it, that the tent lay alone. And in his fellow answer, and his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else. This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Well, I'm going to see if I can read this again. And his fellow answered and said, This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for into his hand had God delivered Midian and all the host. And it was so, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and interpretation thereof, that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel, and said, Arise, for the Lord has delivered into you, your hand, the host of Midian. So here we get this dream here in Judges 13. So let me kind of read a little bit so we can get an understanding of what, from the Union Gospel Press commentary here. God assured Gideon, by the 3,000 men, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into thy hand. As Gideon and his men were camped on the hillside above the Midianites, God gave him more instructions to help encourage him and erase any fear that he might have in his heart. He told Gideon to go down to the Midianite camp with his servant and listen to what was being said there. So here we see here is that it's similar to spies. Gideon and his servant, they slipped down into the valley of the Midianite camp when they overheard a man telling his companion. Now, this is not Gideon's men telling this story. These are Midianites, as we see here, that are telling this dream. Okay? So, while they overheard a man telling his companion a dream he had just had, it was surely the hand of God that directed them to this place at that moment, because the Midianite camp was huge. I really would like you to see God's hand in working. God knew he had to, I would say, give Gideon as much confidence as he needed to do this. So here God here, knowing it all, arranged a man in the Midianite camp to have a dream. Not only that, arranged for Gideon and his servant to actually go and spy out the place so they can hear that very dream and the interpretation, to give Gideon the confidence to overtake this large group of men on camelback. You see how everything is put into place here. All God's doing, God's hand is here of all of that. So here, getting back to it, it was surely the hand of God that directed them to this place at this moment. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitudes, for both they were camels, were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. Here it speaks of the Midianite camp, which is huge. The Midianites came driving their cows, their tents. They came as grasshoppers. If you ever seen a grasshopper invasion, you can get that understanding. Large numbers. The multitudes they were with, and their camels were without number. In other words, there was numerous camels that they had here. And they entered into the land to destroy it. Now, that's according to chapter 6. Verse 5. You see where we see the Midianites. It was, I guess, you can call it jealousy because the Israelites were prosperous or what have you, but they were also fearful of this Midianite army. And every time during harvest season, massive numbers would show up so they can feed their camel, feed their people, destroy what the Israelites had. So this dream here was a loaf of barley bread had come tumbling into the Midianite camp. When it reached one of the tents, it knocked it over and completely collapsed it. This was his dream. A loaf of barley bread come tumbling into the Midianite camp. When it reached one of the tents, it knocked it over and completely collapsed. In Old Testament days, dreams often had messages for those who dreamed them. A good example is Joseph, who had 2 dreams when he was young to indicate he would someday rule over his family. So when this man had this dream, he took it as carrying some kind of message. He might have been repeating it to his companion because he wondered what it meant. We know God was in the entire scenario. He had commissioned his servant Gideon to lead the Israelites out from under the bondage of the Midianites. In the flow of events, he had even given the dream. So, in verse 14 here, we talk of the interpretation here. The dream itself may have been somewhat encouraging to Gideon without any further explanation, since it describes a mishap within the Midianite camp. And yet God chose to provide the dream as well as a powerful and very specific interpretation to give Gideon extra assurance about what he was going to do. We read what the companion of the dreamer said concerning the dream, but we cannot know for certain what his attitude was. What he was trying to jest, or what somehow was he somewhat fearful? It seems possible that the Midianite camp was aware that Gideon had gathered some forces to come against him. But how much was known about Gideon's army is impossible to conjecture. Maybe this man was making fun of the fact that Gideon was preparing to come against him with a small force of men. Or maybe he sensed that God's people were a force to be reckoned with and not taken lightly. His statement was there that the dream indicated that the sword of Gideon was about to defeat the Midianite and turn them over to his hand. The dream spelled defeat for the Midianites. So, what destroys the tent? It wasn't a hurricane that destroyed this tent. It wasn't a cyclone, or earthquake, or tornado, or fire, or plague, or rock, or bolt of lightning. A barley loaf, a barley bun. Let's say a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread destroys this tent. Not a big oversized bun. From Gideon's perspective, God showed him again that a small, insignificant, almost silly object can attack and overcome the most prestigious of foes. And once again, we see the sovereign God was in control of the situation. His timing was perfect in that Gideon arrived just as the Midianite was telling the dream. This was also Gideon's need to confirm his assignment from God. The meaning of this dream was clear to him. The principal thought is to notice that God knows and understands the human needs of his children. He knew Gideon's perplexity. He took occasion to remove it. God did not need to do this, for Gideon really should not have been perplexed. God told him from the beginning that he would deliver Midian into his hands. Later, he graciously told him again, this through an unusual fleece test. Gideon should have simply believed. God, no matter what developed, recognized that God knows all about these developments when he has given the earlier assurances. Gideon should not have let the circumstances influence him to doubt. While this quote may very well be true, most of us are not so strong in our faith that we could accept such unusual instructions without wondering about them, and experiencing some doubt as Gideon did. So here in verse 15 here, we read in hearing the dream and its interpretation, God gave Gideon exactly what he needed at that moment. He immediately recognized the dream and its interpretation as a message from God. His first response was to worship, after which he returned to the camp with confidence and announced that the time had come for Israel to advance, because God was going. Let me read this once again. His first response was to worship, after which he returned to camp with confidence and announced the time that had come for Israel to advance, because God was going to deliver the Midianites into their hands. Often God graciously confirms us the direction in which he is leading us. If we are sensitive to such confirmations and observant with their presence, we can know much joy in following him. So here in this second outline here, we tend to find out as Gideon gets, is reassured again. Gideon gets the message, it's time to move. And all of this against the Midianites. This 300 men that he had. It's time to move about and to destroy them and to rid them out of the land. So we move on here to this last part. Here is the conclusion here. And it is actually at Judges chapter 8, verse 22 through 25. And here we have, it reads here in our Union Gospel Press here. It says, Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son, and thy son's sons also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that ye would give me every man the earring of his prey. For they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, We will willingly give them. And they spared a garment, and did cast therein every man the earring of his prey. Before I begin to read the Union Gospel Press commentary here, I'm going to give my own little idea of what I see going on here. The army has defeated the Midianites, had gotten rid of them. Now these men here, they want Gideon and his son and his son's son, his grandson, or what have you. They want to set up some type of kingdomship here. But we see here, as Gideon, we see in this area where he talks, he doesn't want to do none of that, because Gideon knows it is God's hand who has delivered them. And then he reminds them, I won't rule over you. My son will not rule over you. Okay? Let the Lord shall rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. That is what he's given them to do. But however, this is just me. Once again, in verse 24, I see whereas something else is about to be set in place. Because if we remember back before when Joshua took over Jericho, that they were not supposed to take any spoils of war for themselves. But I see here in verse 24 where these men have taken spoils of war. Not only that, I see here where Gideon here is asking for a portion of that and accepting it. That's why here, now again, once again, this is what I see. I see another, a rise somewhat in the beginning of doing something what God had told him not to do back in Joshua. So I gathered that just by reading that and remembering. So here we go here. In Judges chapter 8, verse 22 to 23. A request refused. Using the very unusual tactic, Gideon led his men against the Midianites. Having stationed 300 men around the camp, Gideon had them break pitchers, blow trumpets, and yell. God used this unorthodox means to cause panic among the Midianites. And they stood every man in his place around about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host, and the host fled. Once the Midianites had taken flight, a large army gathered around Gideon and pursued the enemy, completing the victory. After a number of details were taken care of the following victory, the men of Israel came to Gideon with a proposal. Their request was that Gideon rule over them and establish a dynasty. That would continue after his death. They were so grateful for the way he had led them into victory over the Midianites, and so confident of his leadership abilities that they wanted to give them this added security. Gideon, however, realized that it was not really his ability that had given them the victory. He knew it was God who had given him explicit instructions and a series of confirmations. He knew that their desire for him to be king indicate their lack of understanding about God's role in what had happened. He refused their offer and declared, "The Lord shall rule over you." And it would be Gideon knew that it was the Lord who delivered them. But these men here, maybe all they saw was that Gideon was the one who was leading the charge. It was difficult for them to see that it wasn't God. And Gideon had to reaffirm with them at the end of this portion of the text. And he said, "Let the Lord rule over you." So here in verse 20, moving to Judges chapter 8, verse 24 and 25. Here's called a request accepted. These verses set a scene for a very sad ending regarding Gideon. After refusing the people's request for him to rule over them, Gideon presents a request of his own. He asks that everyone bring to him all the earrings that had been taken in the plunder following their victory over the Midianites. The text explains that they were made of gold. The Midianites wore gold rings on their ears and noses, as these had been taken by the Israelite soldiers as part of their plunder. The soldiers had no idea why this request was given, but their gratitude for what Gideon had done for the nation caused them to cooperate immediately. They said they were glad to do it for him, so they spread out the garment onto which everyone could place an earring. It would be nice if the accounts of Gideon's life ended with his declaration that God should rule. That ought to be the desire in each of our hearts, that he be in charge of our lives. Gideon's life, however, served not only as an example, but also as a warning. He grew in faith and accomplished a great work for God, but he also did something that was extremely harmful to both himself and the people of Israel, whom he had delivered. He took gold and made an ephod, which was later used as idol worship. And what I guess here's the message. What the greatest, Gideon did a great thing close to the end, in the beginning. He wanted the people to turn toward the Lord. He wanted the Lord to be their leader. But I don't know what happened in between there when he wanted part of the spoils of war. And in doing that, once again, we're going to begin to see another downfall in Judges here. So it's almost as if they didn't learn from their forefathers. Something was missing. It's either it could be history, it could be what have you, but these things should be passed down, so we don't cause these things even in our own lives, our family lives. Any wrongdoing. I don't know if I'm not gonna say Gideon was a greedy man. I don't know that, but I would hope that it would have came out a lot better than what he did. But from what I see he's setting up once again at the very end something bad for his household and also for the house of Israel. So I want to kind of go into what we call the heart of the lesson. Just these 3 points here, and then we'll just go from there. But let me read a little introduction here from just reading the heart of this here. The Israelites had again turned away from the Lord in the time of Gideon. They were suffering under the cruel hand of the Midianites. The nomadic people from the south raided Israel, destroying their crops and leaving them impoverished. When the people cried out to God, the Lord once again raised up a judge named Gideon. Gideon considered himself ill-prepared to deliver God's people, and his faith was weak. But God assured him of success and eventually brought him and an army of Israelites to prepare to battle the enemy. The account of Gideon, however, is really the account of God, who through it all shows himself to be a true leader and ruler of Israel. Point 1 for us to just try to remember. God directed the selection. Gideon had with him an army of 32,000, which was still a mere fraction of the 135,000 Midianites encamped nearby. Yet God knew that if he gave this army victory, the people will only take pride in themselves rather than give God the glory. So the Lord instructed Gideon to reduce the size of his army by allowing those who were fearful to return home. This left Gideon with only 10,000 men. The Lord then told Gideon there were still too many men for the job. He instructed Gideon to select only those soldiers who drank from their hands And when they went to the water for refreshment, this reduced Gideon's army to only 300 men. God's purpose was clear here. He and he alone was to be acknowledged as Israel's deliverer. Neither Gideon nor his army could possibly claim credit if they defeated the vast Midianite army with a force of only 300 men. So that's point one. God directed the selection of the army. Point two here. God encouraged Gideon here. That would be, you would say, it's chapter 7, verse 13 to 15. Even with God's clear direction, the task before Gideon must have seemed daunting. Earlier, Gideon is in his weakness. He sought supernatural assurances from God that he would save Israel through him. Now, God graciously gave Gideon further assurance, even though he had not requested it. The Lord told Gideon to go down to the Midianite camp where he would be strengthened to go to battle. When Gideon did so, he overheard a Midianite recounting a dream, which another Midianite interpreted as meaning that the Midianites would fall before Gideon. This news greatly encouraged Gideon and his return to prepare his troops for battle. So therefore, the Lord knows our weaknesses and concerns even before we voice them. He graciously, repeatedly encourages us to walk in faith and trust in him. Such encouragement was just what Gideon needed. He went forth and saw God give Israel great victory. So here in this second point here, we see how God has set it up to encourage Gideon. Okay, allowing him, God bringing the dream to the Midianites, God bringing Gideon and his servant close to the Midianite camp to allow Gideon to hear this. That's great there. That is God. In other words, having his hand on it all, because he knows us. He knows what our capabilities are. Now, here's the third point. The third point here, God rules his people. Following the amazing victory over the Midianites, the people of Israel called upon Gideon to rule over them as king. Even if the people had not learned the lesson, Gideon had. How could he rule as king when God had not decreed it? And when God had shown that he alone was their king, it was to God that they owed their deliverance, not Gideon. Like Gideon, we must never claim glory for ourselves or those things God alone has done. That is the great point. So there's 3 points. God directs the selection of the army. He encourages Gideon in many different ways. Not only that, even when the victory is in the hands of the Israelites, Gideon knows who is to be glorified. Not only that, he goes on and he shares with the men, not I, it is the Lord. That there, right there, within itself, to tell them, I don't want to let God be your leader. Let God rule over you, not I. Allow God to do it. That's humbleness there. Because any other man in this day and age, if you would ask to do that, he would greatly join it because he would think he would be into himself. Here we have Gideon, a man of just a working person around that probably known in the neighborhood by very few. God uses him, but his head doesn't get big and swollen. He goes about that and in doing the things that that needs to be done. That is a great part of doing that. So in this lesson here, I I hope that we kind of learn. So I want to get into the, I guess, a little research and discussion here. Just 1 or 2 points. Things. How do you think Gideon and his army felt when God reduced their numbers to 300? How would you feel if you feel like you had a large group of people working under you trying to go about doing certain things, but then you find out there are a lot of them are peeled off and they've been reduced? How do you feel? I'll give you some help. Now, I don't know right now the scripture number, but I would say this here. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, Jesus said, there I am in the midst. What more do you need? Just enough. Enough to go to humble you and go and say, it wasn't you that did it. It's God. Give God his glory. So here we are. What does God allow Gideon to hear the Midianite soldier's dream in its interpretation to tell you about his care for us? So, how is it that God cares for Gideon? God knows what, if Gideon has any reservations right now of going into battle, God himself has to set up this dream. He has to basically move Gideon's feet to allow him to sneak into the Midianite camp so he can hear this. That's what it is. So what does Gideon, when Gideon hears this, he does not wait until morning or 2 days and say, let us rise. He goes back immediately and say, let us rise, because God has delivered the Midianites. He's not procrastinating. He's not waiting. Let's go. Let's go now. That is the great part of that. So that is something that in this here lesson here that we should be able to listen to whatever the difficulty is, whatever we don't think we're equipped for in doing God's work. If we don't allow him to use us, whatever it is, in our weakness, allow him to strengthen us. And we will be able to do great things for the Lord. But the one thing that we must also understand, it is not us doing it. It is the Lord. Whatever reward he gives you, so be it. But it is not for us to go out and claim our own reward or our own fame. Allow God to give it to us. And therefore, it will be whole and understanding. That's what this here is about here. Gideon, a small man. When I say small, I ain't going to say small in height or what have you. A man that doesn't, in other words, wherever he goes, nobody knows his name. Some do, some don't. Just a regular man out there working or what have you, or doing whatever he needs. He's not known. But God used him to be a deliverer for Israel. However, Gideon also says it is God, the Lord, who delivered Israel, not I. I'd like to thank you for joining in with us today. And I hope and pray that you would also join in with us next Saturday. But this is something that you can take here this coming week. This message here, this Sunday school lesson, even tomorrow, and you can continue to discuss it and see what you as your church family get out of it. I think this was the great lesson here. I've always seen Gideon Bibles, but then again, you ask the question, who is Gideon? I would encourage you to continue to read in the book of Judges about Gideon and get a view of the whole story so you can come into a great understanding of it and how God worked. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you once again for joining in with us, and we will see you again next week. Thank you very much.
Redeemer Missionary Baptist Church, Lancaster, every Saturday at 10 a.m. with Dr. Kevin Nabel Sr. Redeemer Missionary